Sarah Mitchell hadn't slept in 36 hours. She sat in her cramped Civic outside the County District Court building in Houston, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Dark circles shadowed her eyes like bruises. Her hair hung limp despite the careful curling she'd done that morning, and stress lines creased her forehead in ways that hadn't existed a year ago. She was only 32, but today she looked 50. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white, and tried to steady her breathing. In the backseat, her 3-year-old son dozed fitfully in his car seat, still wearing the tiny blue button-down shirt she'd purchased specifically for this day. She had saved for 2 weeks to buy it, wanting him to look presentable, wanting the judge to see that she cared about details, that she was a good mother. The courthouse loomed before her like a monument to her failure. Sarah had always believed in the system, had always trusted that truth and justice prevailed. But as she'd spent the last 3 months navigating the family court process, she discovered a terrifying reality. The system wasn't designed to protect mothers like her. It was designed to destroy them. Everything had spiraled when David filed for full custody 2 months ago. Her ex-husband, the man she'd once loved and now barely tolerated, had hired Martin, a family law attorney known for his ruthlessness and his ability to manipulate judges. According to David's petition, Sarah was negligent, absent, and emotionally distant. The accusations felt like daggers. Yes, she worked 70-hour weeks as a trauma nurse at Houston Methodist Hospital. Yes, that meant long shifts, overnight rotations, and weekends consumed by other people's emergencies. But every single hour she worked was for. Every hospital shift paid his food, his clothes, his medical bills. She'd done it alone since David had walked out 2 years ago, leaving her with a mortgage she couldn't afford and a child she loved more than her own life. Sarah heard stirring in the backseat and turned to look at him. He was still mostly asleep, his stuffed rabbit tucked under his chin, his chest rising and falling peacefully. He had no idea what today meant. To him, this was just another day, an adventure with his mom to a big building he didn't understand. He didn't know that his father wanted to take him away, didn't comprehend that a judge would decide where he'd live, didn't realize his entire world could be rearranged by people in power suits who didn't know him at all. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from her attorney, Robert, "See you in 30 minutes, stay strong, we have a solid case." But they didn't have a solid case. That was the problem. David had money, a successful businessman with a steady income and a new girlfriend who could help care for. Sarah had her salary, which sounded impressive until you subtracted rent, utilities, and the mounting medical debt from a car accident that wasn't even her fault. The court didn't care about Sarah's sacrifices. It didn't care that she'd given up dating, social life, and any semblance of personal happiness to be present for whenever she wasn't working. All the court saw were statistics: an absentee mother working excessive hours, while a stable father with resources stood ready to provide a more balanced home. She unbuckled her and twisted around to adjust shirt one more time. His small face was angelic in sleep. He had her nose, David's dark eyes, and an innocence that broke her heart knowing what was about to happen. She kissed his forehead gently, breathing in the scent of his baby shampoo mixed with the sweetness of sleep. "Mommy's going to fix this, baby," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "Everything's going to be okay." But everything wasn't going to be okay. She could feel it in her bones, that preternatural knowing that sometimes grips mothers when their children are in danger. And was in danger, not from her, never from her, but from a system that didn't understand sacrifice, didn't value her relentless devotion, and certainly didn't believe that a working mother could be enough. Sarah checked the time, 8:47 a.m. The hearing was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. She gently shook awake, whispering softly so as not to frighten him. His eyes opened slowly, confused and drowsy. "Good morning, sweetheart. We need to go inside now, okay? Remember what Mommy told you. We're going to see a very nice judge." Rubbed his eyes with his tiny fists, his stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. "Judge," he repeated, testing the unfamiliar word. He had no frame of reference for what a judge was, no concept of courts or custody battles or the seismic shift about to occur in his life. "That's right, baby. Just be my good boy, okay? Stay quiet and hold Mommy's hand." She helped him out of the car seat, straightening his shirt again, smoothing his dark hair, mentally reviewing everything she'd been coached to do and say. Her attorney had prepped her extensively. Make eye contact with the judge, speak clearly, don't cry, emphasize her love for, highlight her work ethic and stability. But he'd also warned her. The judge has already heard David's side. They've built a narrative. You're going to have to fight to change their mind. Sarah took small hand in hers, and together they walked toward the courthouse entrance. The September heat was oppressive, the Texas sun beating down mercilessly. Her palms were sweating, and she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she worried it might burst through her chest. Other people walked past them, attorneys carrying briefcases, other families heading into their own legal battles, court officers moving with purposeful strides. Everyone seemed so confident, so assured of their place in this world. Sarah felt like a fraud who'd snuck into a place where she didn't belong. As they approached the entrance, she knelt down one final time, bringing herself to eye level. His dark eyes looked up at her with complete trust and unconditional love. He had no idea that his mother was terrified, that she might lose him, that today could be the day everything changed forever. "Mommy loves you so much, more than anything in the whole world. Remember that, okay? No matter what happens today, Mommy loves you." Her voice cracked on the last word, threatening to betray her carefully constructed composure. Wrapped his small arms around her neck. "Love you too, Mommy." Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, burning this moment into her memory. The weight of him in her arms, the innocence in his voice, the unconditional love that radiated from her child. Then she pulled back, stood up, took his hand and walked into the courthouse. Everything was about to change. The courtroom was smaller than Sarah had imagined, not the grand, imposing chamber of television dramas, but rather an austere, beige-walled room that smelled of wood polish and institutional resignation. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly, clinical glow. Judge Henderson sat elevated on the bench, her black robes draped like the wings of some dark bird, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that gave her face the appearance of a skull. She was in her late 60s, with sharp eyes that had apparently seen every manipulation, every lie, every desperate plea a broken family could muster in 32 years of family court. Sarah immediately understood from the judge's expression that she was not going to be sympathetic. There was no warmth in those eyes, no maternal recognition from one woman to another. There was only judicial detachment, the look of someone whose soul had been worn down by the endless parade of suffering humanity passing through her courtroom. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table beside her attorney, Robert, while David and his lawyer, Martin, occupied the opposing table. Was exactly as Robert had described him, a shark in a suit, with silver hair that cost more than Sarah made in a month and teeth so white they seemed almost luminescent. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case that mattered, someone accustomed to winning. He glanced at Sarah once with barely concealed contempt, then turned his attention to, his expression morphing into something almost paternal. It was obscene. Sarah wanted to throw something at him. Sat beside her, swinging his legs since they didn't reach the ground. He was clutching his stuffed rabbit and looking around the courtroom with wide eyes, trying to process the strangeness of it all. Sarah squeezed his hand gently, silently begging him to be good, to be quiet, to be the perfect child. She was already mentally calculating how his behavior would be judged, whether sitting still would be seen as positive or whether the judge would interpret his silence as fear caused by his mother's stressful career. There was no winning here. Every detail could be twisted. Judge Henderson called the court to order, her voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic authority. "This is the custody hearing for James Mitchell, minor child of Sarah Caroline Mitchell and David Thomas Mitchell. Counselor, You may proceed with your opening statement. Stood with theatrical grace, buttoning his suit jacket and stepping toward the jury box, though there was no jury, just Judge Henderson taking notes with practiced efficiency. His opening statement was surgical in its precision. He painted David as a devoted father, a successful entrepreneur with stable income and a secure home environment. Then he turned to Sarah, and his words became instruments of destruction. Your Honor, the plaintiff in this case is a woman who has chosen her career over her child. Night shifts, weekend rotations, 70-hour work weeks, these aren't the schedule of a devoted mother. These are the choices of someone whose priorities are fundamentally misaligned with the needs of a 3-year-old child who requires consistent parental presence and emotional availability. His voice was smooth, reasonable, almost sympathetic. While we respect Ms. Mitchell's work ethic, we must ask ourselves, at what cost? At what cost to her son? Sarah felt her attorney's hand on her arm, a silent warning to maintain composure. Her face remained neutral, but inside, fury was building like a pressure cooker with the valve rusted shut. At what cost? The cost of keeping a roof over their heads, the cost of food on the table, the cost of everything she'd sacrificed since David walked out and left her with nothing but debt and a baby to raise alone. Continued, his narrative building methodically. He presented evidence, testimony from David's girlfriend about how organized and clean David's home was, documentation of David's income and 401k, a character witness from David's country club who attested to his stability and moral character. Everything was calculated to paint David as the responsible parent and Sarah as a negligent workaholic. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. Sarah didn't deserve her son. Then Judge Henderson turned to Robert. Counselor, do you have an opening statement? Robert stood, and Sarah felt a flutter of hope. Robert was good. She'd spent nearly her entire savings on his retainer fee, mortgaging her future because she couldn't afford to lose. But as he began speaking about Sarah's dedication to her consistent employment, her stable housing, his words felt inadequate against orchestrated narrative. The judge was already taking notes before he even finished. The testimony began. David took the stand, and under gentle questioning, he became the aggrieved father forced to seek custody because his ex-wife was an absent parent. I love my son more than anything, he said, his voice trembling with what seemed like genuine emotion. I want nothing more than for to be with me, to have a real home where someone is actually present to raise him. Sarah's hands clenched into fists under the table. Lies. All lies. She'd raised alone for 2 years while David played businessman and weekend father, showing up when it was convenient, leaving when it wasn't. And when you have, asked, his tone encouraging, what is your schedule like? I work from home most days now, David answered smoothly. A lie, since Sarah knew he kept an office downtown where he spent at least 40 hours a week. I've arranged my life around being a parent. My girlfriend helps tremendously with and household management, would have a stable, consistent environment. The girlfriend. Sarah hated the girlfriend, a 26-year-old named Brittany who treated like a pet project rather than a human being. Sarah had seen the Instagram photos, in designer clothes at expensive restaurants, being displayed like proof of David's parenting capabilities. It was all for show. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she tried to convey her love for, her commitment to his, the fact that every hour she worked was to provide for him. But Robert's questions felt scripted, defensive rather than assertive. And when cross-examined her, he was relentless. Ms. Mitchell, isn't it true that you've missed multiple parent-teacher conferences at? I work night shifts, so. A simple yes or no will suffice. Yes or no. Yes, but. And isn't it also true that you've left in care for up to 12 hours at a time? Sarah wanted to scream. She'd missed conferences because her hospital scheduled her shifts without input from her, because she was working to keep fed and housed and safe. But the way presented it, She sounded like a villain who didn't care about her son's education. By the time the morning session ended for recess, Sarah felt devastated. Judge Henderson's expression had shifted from neutral to skeptical. The evidence seemed stacked against her. She could see the judge's conclusions forming: ambitious career woman, neglectful mother, unstable home. David had money, stability, a girlfriend willing to help, and apparently a judge who valued those things more than a mother's desperate love. In the hallway during recess, Sarah couldn't stop her hands from shaking. Asked if he could go to the bathroom, and she took him, locking herself in the stall afterward and allowing herself exactly 3 minutes to cry silently, her hand covering her mouth so no one would hear. She was losing. She could feel it with absolute certainty. She was about to lose her son. The lunch break felt eternal. Sarah sat in a small conference room that Robert had reserved, pushing food around a plastic plate without actually eating. Mercifully, had fallen asleep on the uncomfortable sofa beside her, exhausted from the strange morning. Sarah stared at him, committing every detail to memory: the way his chest rose and fell, the innocent expression on his sleeping face, the stuffed rabbit clutched against his body like a lifeline. She was trying to memorize him, preparing herself for a future where she might not see this face every single day. Robert had attempted to be encouraging during lunch, pointing out moments where her testimony had been strong, reminding her that they still had the afternoon session and opportunities to rehabilitate her image. But they both knew the truth. The judge had made up her mind. Sarah had seen it in those cold eyes, in the way Henderson's pen moved across her notepad during opening statement versus the sparse notes during Sarah's testimony. The judge had already decided. "We still have options," Robert said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We can introduce character witnesses, get statements from your colleagues at the hospital about your work ethic, maybe even get providers to testify about behavioral health. It's not over." But it was over. Sarah knew the mathematics of family court. David had money, stability, and a narrative that fit the judge's preconceptions about ambitious women who chose careers over children. Sarah had desperation and love apparently wasn't a sufficient legal argument. At 1:45 p.m., Sarah gently woke, cleaned his face with wet napkins from her purse, and straightened his little blue shirt again. They walked back into the courthouse together, her hand holding his like she was anchoring herself to something real in a world gone insane. The afternoon session would determine the rest of their lives, and Sarah felt like she was walking toward an execution. The courtroom was already filling with people. Judge Henderson sat on her bench reviewing documents. David and were huddled together, whispering confidently. Robert took his seat beside Sarah, and she noticed his jaw was clenched. Immediately began fidgeting, swinging his legs and playing with the rabbit's ears. Sarah was grateful for his restlessness, his innocence. His complete inability to understand the magnitude of what was happening offered a small mercy. Judge Henderson called the court to order promptly at 2:00 p.m. "We'll continue with the Mitchell custody hearing. Counselor, I believe you have additional witnesses." Robert stood, looking slightly diminished under the judge's gaze. "Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to call Sarah's supervisor at Houston Methodist Hospital to speak to her reliability and—" That's when it happened. The courtroom doors at the back burst open with sudden violence, the metal handle slamming against the interior wall. Everyone turned, irritated by the interruption. Officer James stood in the doorway, and beside him was Bella, a massive German Shepherd police dog, her muscular frame tense, her alert eyes scanning the courtroom. The K-9 unit was scheduled in the adjacent courtroom for an unrelated narcotics trafficking case. An officer had made a wrong turn coming back from a bathroom break, accidentally opening the wrong door. The courtroom fell into stunned silence for approximately 2 seconds. Judge Henderson's face flushed with irritation, about to issue a stern reprimand to the officer for the disruption. This was a family court proceeding, serious business, and courtroom protocol was sacred. The judge opened her mouth to speak. That's when screamed, "That's the doggy! That's the doggy!" His voice pierced the courtroom like a siren, shocking in its intensity and its absolute certainty. He wasn't just pointing, he was standing up in his seat, his entire body rigid with recognition mixed with something else. Fear, maybe, or trauma, or some combination of emotions too complex for a 3-year-old to articulate, but unable to suppress. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She grabbed for, instinctively trying to pull him back into his seat, but he was beyond her reach, beyond reason, consumed by whatever ancient fear or memory had suddenly exploded to the surface of his consciousness. His face was flushed, his eyes wide and terrified, his finger pointing directly at Bella with an intensity that suggested he knew this dog intimately, that this dog meant something significant to him. "Baby, sit down," Sarah whispered urgently but ignored her completely. He was still pointing, still screaming, tears beginning to roll down his cheeks. His stuffed rabbit fell to the floor, forgotten. The entire courtroom had frozen. Robert's pen stopped moving mid-note. David's confident expression shifted to confusion. Looked like someone had slapped him. Judge Henderson's irritation transformed into sharp, analytical interest. Officer looked bewildered, unable to comprehend why a toddler was having what appeared to be an emotional breakdown over his police dog. Sarah's mind was racing, scrambling for explanations. Had never mentioned a police dog. She'd never taken him near law enforcement. She'd never discussed dogs with him at length. So where was this coming from? How did he know this dog? Why was he so frightened? Judge Henderson stood up. "Officer, please wait," she commanded, her judicial authority cutting through the chaos. Her eyes narrowed as she watched, really watched him, studying his reaction with the intense focus of someone accustomed to detecting truth beneath layers of deception and manipulation. Sarah pulled back into his seat firmly, wrapping her arms around him to hold him in place. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," she repeated, though her voice was shaking. "It's just a dog, it's fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing was fine. Her 3-year-old son was experiencing what looked like a trauma response to a dog he shouldn't even know. "How do you know that dog?" Sarah whispered, her face buried against his hair, her words meant only for him. But he couldn't answer. He was crying now, the tears flowing freely, his body trembling against hers. Officer looked down at Bella, then back at the courtroom full of people staring at him. "I'm sorry for the interruption, Your Honor. This is K9 Bella. She's here for another case. I took a wrong turn." But Judge Henderson wasn't looking at Officer anymore. She was looking at with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read, a combination of curiosity and suspicion, and something else. Something that suggested the judge had suddenly remembered that she was trained to recognize when something didn't add up. "Officer, don't leave," Judge Henderson said, her voice quiet but commanding. She made a notation on her legal pad. "We're going to take a brief recess. Counselor, meet me in chambers. Officer, please wait outside." As Sarah held her sobbing son, watching the judge disappear into her private chambers, she felt the foundation of everything shift beneath her. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she knew with absolute certainty that something had fundamentally changed about this case. The unexpected appearance of a police dog and her son's inexplicable recognition of it had cracked open something in the proceedings, something that might destroy David's carefully constructed narrative, or something that might destroy her. There was no way to know which. The moment crystallized in slow motion, small body launching forward, his legs pumping with determination, his arm extended in an accusatory point toward the German Shepherd. Sarah's reflexes kicked in half a second too late. She lunged for him, her fingers grasping at air where her son's shirt had been just microseconds before. The crowd gasped in unison, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck oxygen from the room. "That's the doggy! That's the doggy!" screamed again, his voice piercing and absolute in its certainty. He wasn't confused, wasn't playing, wasn't being a typical toddler seeking attention. This was primal. This was deep. This was the kind of recognition that transcends normal 3-year-old behavior and speaks to something buried in his developing consciousness. Sarah caught up with him just as he reached the bar separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. She grabbed him, pulling him back against her body, her arms wrapping around his torso like a cage. "No, stop. Come back," she hissed, her voice urgent and panicked, but was struggling against her, his body rigid, his eyes locked on Bella with an intensity that terrified Sarah far more than anything David's lawyer had said all morning. Officer's hand instinctively moved to Bella's harness. The dog sensed the commotion and her body tensed, her ears perked forward, her behavioral training kicking in. She wasn't aggressive. Bella was a professional, trained to remain calm in chaotic situations, but her alertness was immediate and visible. The officer pulled slightly on the leash, uncertain whether to leave the courtroom or wait for direction. He looked completely baffled. In his 15 years as a K-9 handler, had encountered hundreds of reactions to Bella, but nothing like this. Never had a child screamed at the dog with such visceral recognition. "Officer, remain where you are," Judge Henderson commanded, still in her seat but leaning forward, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She was watching with the focus of a scientist studying a rare specimen. Her expression had shifted entirely from irritation to analytical intensity. Whatever this was, it had captured her complete attention. Robert stood beside Sarah, frozen, his legal instincts struggling to process what was happening. His pen had fallen to the table. His mouth was slightly open. He looked like someone watching a building collapse in real time, aware that something catastrophic was occurring, but unable to formulate a response. David's expression had transformed. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely. He was staring at with confusion mixed with something darker, concern, perhaps, or the dawning realization that something he'd carefully hidden was about to be exposed. His hand moved toward Martin's arm, but was also frozen, his usual courtroom composure cracked. Sarah's mind was spinning through impossible mathematics. How did know this dog? Where had he seen this dog? The police dog must have been somewhere that had been. But when? Sarah worked night shifts at the hospital, attended during the day. On weekends they did normal things, parks, grocery stores, sometimes David's house. But officer and this dog, these were the variables she couldn't account for. Unless. The thought struck her like a physical blow. Unless had seen this dog at David's house. But why would a police dog be at David's residence? Sarah's mind began scrolling through possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Had there been an incident at David's house? Something the police responded to? Something involving? The thought made her nauseated. Her protective instincts flared immediately, her arms tightening around her son. "Sweetheart, look at Mommy," Sarah whispered desperately, trying to redirect his attention away from Bella. But was crying now, actual tears streaming down his face, his body trembling with an emotion too large for a 3-year-old to contain. He was still pointing, still whimpering, still absolutely fixated on the dog. Judge Henderson stood, her black robe swishing as she moved. She stepped off the bench with deliberate slowness, her eyes still locked on. "Counselor," she said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had suddenly realized something significant was wrong. "When was the last time your client's son visited the defendant's residence?" Robert looked. "Your Honor, that information is in the custody arrangement documents. Visitation is typically scheduled for alternate weekends and—" "I didn't ask for a schedule. I asked when was the last time." Judge Henderson's voice had taken on an edge that made everyone in the courtroom sit. Sarah's attorney scrambled. "This past weekend. The defendant had on Saturday and Sunday. He was returned to Ms. Mitchell on Sunday evening at 6 p.m. "And did you notice anything unusual about the child when he returned?" the judge asked, her eyes still on Sarah. Sarah felt all the air leave her lungs. She looked at with sudden clarity. Yes. Yes, there had been something unusual, had been quieter than normal. He'd had nightmares both nights that week. He'd been clingy and anxious. She'd attributed it to typical toddler adjustment, but now she was seeing it through the lens of suspicion. What had happened at David's house? "Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning," interjected, standing abruptly. His confident demeanor had been replaced by something defensive and sharp. "This is improper. We're in the middle of a custody hearing, and now you're interrogating the plaintiff about what? A child's reaction to a dog. This is circus behavior." "Sit down, counselor," Judge Henderson said flatly, not even looking at him. She descended the steps from the bench and walked toward Sarah, and, up close, her eyes were penetrating, calculated. She had spent 32 years in family court. She had seen every manipulation, every cover-up, every way that parents could harm their children while maintaining perfect facades. And right now, she was looking at a 3-year-old whose body language screamed trauma. "Ms. Mitchell," Judge Henderson said quietly, "has your son's behavior changed in recent weeks?" Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, nightmares, anxiety, clinginess, but I thought it was normal adjustment." The judge nodded slowly. She turned to Officer. "Officer, was there a police response at 4527 Drive in the past month?" His eyes widened. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be his patrol logs. "Yes, Your Honor, 2 weeks ago. Domestic disturbance call. That's the defendant's address, isn't it?" Sarah felt the room tilt. 2 weeks. That would have been during his last visit to David's house. The visitation before the one that just happened. Judge Henderson turned back to the courtroom, her expression grim. "We are going to take an extended recess. Officer, I need to speak with you privately about that police response. Counselor, you and Ms. Mitchell will remain available. Counselor, you may speak with your client, but I'm warning you now. If I discover that you and the defendant have information relevant to a child's safety and welfare, we will be discussing the consequences." As Officer followed Judge Henderson into her chambers, David's confident mask completely crumbled. He looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. And Sarah, holding her frightened, crying son, suddenly realized that everything was about to change. She had no idea how much. Judge Henderson's private chambers smelled like old law books and expensive coffee. Officer sat in an uncomfortable chair across from her mahogany desk, his K-9 handler uniform suddenly feeling too formal for what was about to be discussed. The judge held a thick file folder in her hands, the police report from 2 weeks prior. Her silver reading glasses perched on her nose as she scrolled through the documentation with methodical precision. "Walk me through this call," she said, not looking up from the report. "What was the nature of the disturbance at 4527 Drive?" Officer shifted uncomfortably. He had been patrolling that evening when the 911 call came in, a noise complaint from neighbors reporting raised voices, sounds of things being broken, and a child crying. Standard domestic disturbance. When he and his partner arrived, they'd found the front door partially open. Bella had accompanied them as part of protocol for any potentially volatile situation. The defendant, David Mitchell, answered the door, explained. He appeared intoxicated. The residence was in significant disarray, furniture overturned, broken glass on the kitchen floor. There was a young child present, approximately 3 years old, appearing distressed and confused. Judge Henderson's eyes narrowed above her glasses. "And what did you observe during your investigation?" The defendant claimed he'd simply dropped some dishes, continued. Said he and his son had been playing and things got a little rowdy, but the pattern of destruction didn't match that explanation. The living room furniture was overturned in a way that suggested violence, not play. There were alcohol bottles on the counter, and the defendant's speech was severely slurred. My partner spoke with the neighbors, and they reported this was the 3rd noise complaint in as many weeks. The judge made a note. Did anyone document the child's condition? Hesitated. This was the part that bothered him, the part that had stuck with him over the past 2 weeks. My partner noted in the report that the child appeared frightened and withdrawn. The kid barely spoke. He was clinging to his father despite the apparent violence in the environment. My partner asked if the child was injured, but the defendant said no, that was fine, just scared from the loud noises. Judge Henderson repeated, writing the name down. That's the boy in the courtroom. Yes, Your Honor. I didn't recognize him immediately when I walked into your courtroom. It was his reaction to Bella that jogged my memory. Kids usually respond to her with curiosity or fear of the size. But this kid, he screamed at her like she was something traumatic, something his brain had encoded as connected to danger. Judge Henderson stood, packing to the window overlooking downtown Houston. Officer, in your 15 years as a K-9 handler, have you encountered child trauma responses before? A few times, admitted. Usually kids who've been abused by dogs or kids who witnessed violence. Dogs pick up on trauma sense. Kids pick up on dogs' presence during traumatic events. They associate the dog with what happened. The judge turned back, her expression grave. So if screamed at Bella, it suggests that Bella was present during something traumatic that occurred at the defendant's residence. That's the logical conclusion, confirmed. Judge Henderson's jaw clenched. She returned to her desk and pulled out her computer, typing rapidly. Thank you, officer. Please remain available. I may need you to testify about the details of that police response. After left, Judge Henderson sat alone in her chambers, staring at the police report in front of her. 32 years. She'd been in family court for 32 years, and she had learned to read between the lines of official reports. The language was always sanitized, always careful appeared intoxicated, significant disarray, child appeared distressed. But what those words really meant was, a man drinking heavily, violent destruction of property, and a terrified child witnessing it all. She picked up her phone and called the Houston Police Department's non-emergency line. After explaining her judicial authority and the relevance to an ongoing custody case, she requested the complete file on David Mitchell. She wanted the original 911 call recording. She wanted the responding officer's notes. She wanted anything that hadn't made it into the official written report. 20 minutes later, she was listening to the 911 call. The neighbor's voice was panicked. There's a man yelling at his house. I think he's abusing his son. Please, there's a child screaming. Hurry. Then silence. Then a child's cry, thin and desperate and absolutely heartbreaking. Judge Henderson felt her chest tighten. She'd heard many things in her career, but the sound of a traumatized child never got easier. She closed her eyes and listened to what was unmistakably the voice of a toddler in distress, calling for help, crying without understanding why his world had become violent. The responding officer's notes contained details that hadn't made it into the formal report. Handwritten observations. Defendant reeked of alcohol, multiple empty beer bottles and what appeared to be vodka on kitchen counter. Furniture damage consistent with aggressive throwing, kicking. Child refused to make eye contact. Child flinched when defendant moved. Appeared to be afraid of own father. Recommended CPS involvement. DECLINED by first responders due to defendant's insistence that no abuse occurred and child appearing physically unharmed. That was the problem with the system, Judge Henderson thought bitterly. Physical abuse was difficult to prove. Emotional trauma was invisible. A frightened child could be explained away as overreaction. Alcohol could be dismissed as a one-time incident. The system waited for conclusive evidence before intervening, and by then, damage had already been inflicted. She pulled up the police database and searched for David Mitchell's name. What emerged was damning. 3 prior domestic disturbance calls at his residence in the past 18 months. 2 noise complaints. 1 call for a welfare check that had been dismissed. No arrests, no charges, no CPS involvement. Just a pattern that fell below the threshold of official intervention. But Judge Henderson recognized the pattern. It was the trajectory of someone spiraling into substance abuse, someone whose control was slipping, someone whose violence was escalating. And right now, that someone had unsupervised access to a 3-year-old child for every other weekend. She made another call to Child Protective Services. She requested an immediate home evaluation at David Mitchell's residence. She explained that there was evidence of child endangerment and that a custody hearing was currently in progress. The CPS director promised a team within 24 hours. Judge Henderson sat back in her chair, her mind running through the legal implications and the ethical imperatives. In family court, her job was theoretically to maintain neutrality, to listen to both sides equally, to make decisions based on evidence presented by attorneys. But she'd learned long ago that true neutrality wasn't possible when a child's safety was at stake. The law required her to act as a guardian of last resort, to step in when no one else was protecting the vulnerable. She made one final call to Robert, Sarah's attorney. "Counselor, I need you to prepare your client for some difficult conversations. There are aspects of this case that are about to come to light. I'm also going to need you to gather any documentation about behavioral changes in the child since visitation with the defendant began." After hanging up, Judge Henderson sat alone in the silence of her chambers, thinking about a 3-year-old boy whose screaming recognition of a police dog had just unraveled his father's entire facade. Sometimes justice came through the most unexpected pathways. Sometimes a child's trauma became the catalyst for truth. She gathered the files and headed back to the courtroom, knowing that when she resumed proceedings, everything was going to change. The recess lasted 45 minutes. Sarah sat in the conference room with Robert, her leg bouncing uncontrollably, her mind spiraling through worst-case scenarios. What was happening in the judge's chambers? What did the police call mean? Had witnessed something at David's house? The not knowing was worse than any verdict could be. "Robert, what's going on?" Sarah whispered desperately. Why would the judge ask about police visits to David's house? What police visit? Robert looked equally confused. "I don't know. This is unprecedented. The judge rarely investigates matters outside the scope of what attorneys present. Something about's reaction triggered her investigative instincts, but I don't have access to police records. We'll find out when we return to the courtroom." Sarah felt her stomach twist into knots. She thought about's behavior over the past 2 weeks, the nightmares, the clinginess, the sudden anxiety around loud noises. She'd mentioned it to her pediatrician, who'd suggested it was normal toddler adjustment, but what if it wasn't normal? What if something had happened at David's house that's 3-year-old brain couldn't articulate but his body remembered? When Judge Henderson called them back into the courtroom, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. David looked like a man awaiting execution. His confident demeanor had been replaced with nervous energy, his jaw clenched so tightly Sarah could see the muscle working. Even the court clerk seemed to sense that something significant was about to transpire. Judge Henderson settled back onto the bench, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp as surgical blades. "We're back on the record," she announced. "Before we continue with testimony, I want to address some information that has come to light during the recess. Officer, please return to the witness stand." Officer was sworn in again, and Judge Henderson began her questioning with deliberate slowness. "Officer, you responded to a domestic disturbance call at 4527 Drive on August 15th of this year. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," confirmed. "Please describe what you observed upon arrival." Walk through the details again. The open door, the intoxicated defendant, the overturned furniture, the broken glass, the child's distressed condition. But this time, with Judge Henderson guiding his testimony, the picture became increasingly damning. She asked specific questions. Did the defendant appear to have been drinking? Were there visible signs of substance abuse? What was the child's emotional state? Did the child appear afraid of the defendant? With each question, answers painted a portrait of a home in chaos, a man spiraling into addiction, and a terrified child. Judge Henderson had him describe the specific injuries and furniture damage, had him explain the significance of Bella's presence in a domestic violence situation. Then she turned to David. "Mr. Mitchell, did you have a police visit to your residence 2 weeks ago?" David's face had gone pale. Yes, but—" "Did you have alcohol in your home during that visit?" "There was some, but—" "And your son was present?" "Yes, but nothing happened. The police cleared us. There was no abuse." Judge Henderson's expression hardened. The police responded to a 911 call reporting a child in distress and sounds of violence. They documented significant property damage and noted that your son appeared frightened. That's not clearing you of concerns, Mr. Mitchell. That's documenting a scene. She pulled a document from her stack. "I've also received information from the Houston Police Department indicating that your residence has been the subject of 3 domestic disturbance calls in the past 18 months. 3. Is that correct?" David's attorney was frantically trying to object, but Judge Henderson raised her hand. "Before you begin, counselor, I'm going to inform this court that I've taken judicial notice of police records, which are public information, and I've requested an emergency evaluation from Child Protective Services based on concerns for a child's safety. Now, Mr. Mitchell, are you going to answer my question?" "Your Honor," interjected desperately, "this is completely outside the scope of proper family court proceedings. You're conducting an investigation like a criminal prosecutor. This is improper." Judge Henderson's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Let me inform you of something, counselor. My primary responsibility in family court is the welfare and best interest of the child. When evidence comes before me suggesting that a child has been exposed to violence, substance abuse, and trauma, I have not only the authority but the obligation to investigate. Now, if you wish to prevent your client from answering questions, that's his choice, but his silence speaks volumes." David looked at his attorney, then back at the judge. His carefully constructed facade was crumbling. "There have been some incidents," he admitted quietly. "Incidents?" Judge Henderson repeated, her voice cutting. "You mean violence. You mean drunkenness. You mean exposing your 3-year-old son to traumatic situations." "I've had some stress," David said, his voice now defensive and thin. "Work pressure, the divorce. I've been drinking more than I should, but I would never hurt my son." "Not physically," Judge Henderson said coldly. "But emotional trauma is still trauma. Witnessing violence is still trauma. Being in a home with an intoxicated, aggressive parent is still dangerous." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. Everything was making sense now's nightmares, his clinginess, his fear of loud noises. Her baby had been exposed to his father's violence and substance abuse. Judge Henderson turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, I'd like you to describe any behavioral changes you've observed in your son following his visits to the defendant's residence." Sarah's voice was shaking as she spoke. "Has had nightmares. He wakes up screaming sometimes. He's become clingy. He doesn't want me to leave for work. He's developed new fears. He flinches when things are loud. I took him to the pediatrician and they said it was normal adjustment, but now—" She looked at her son, who was watching her with those dark eyes that seemed far too old for a 3-year-old. "Now I know something scared him." Robert pulled out a folder, documentation from the pediatrician, a dated record of Sarah's concerns written down 3 days after his last visit to David's house. The timeline was perfect. The symptoms matched exposure to domestic violence. Judge Henderson reviewed the documents, her expression grave. "Ms. Mitchell, have you ever witnessed your ex-husband intoxicated around your son?" "Yes," Sarah said quietly. "Several times during exchanges. He showed up to pick up reeking of alcohol. I mentioned it to my attorney and in my concerns to the court, but I didn't have proof. I just knew something was wrong." David started to speak, but Judge Henderson silenced him with a look. "I don't want to hear from you right now, Mr. Mitchell. I'm still forming my conclusions." The courtroom was completely silent. The only sound was the ambient hum of the fluorescent lights and the ticking of the courtroom clock. Judge Henderson made extensive notes, her pen moving steadily across her legal pad. When she finally looked up, her eyes were ice cold. Based on the evidence presented, the police response documentation, the behavioral changes in the child's trauma response to Officers K-9, the testimony regarding substance abuse and domestic violence, I am prepared to issue an emergency protective order. But before I do, I want to speak with the Child Protective Services evaluator. As if on cue, there was a knock on the courtroom door. A CPS representative entered, having been called earlier by the judge. The evaluator had been waiting in the courthouse hallway, ready to testify about the findings from the emergency home evaluation that had been conducted that morning at David's residence. What she described was devastating. Empty alcohol bottles throughout the home, evidence of drug paraphernalia in the bedroom, the living room still bearing marks of the violent incidents, and no appropriate childproofing or safety measures. The CPS report concluded that the residence was unsuitable for a young child, and that the defendant showed signs of active substance abuse requiring intervention. Judge Henderson's expression didn't change, but something had shifted in the courtroom's energy. The truth had emerged, stark and undeniable, and it was about to destroy David's entire case. Judge Henderson stood, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She descended from the bench with measured, deliberate steps, her black robe swishing around her like the wings of a predatory bird. Her expression was grim, unforgiving, and absolutely resolute. She carried herself with the weight of authority earned through 3 decades of witnessing family tragedy and human failure. This was a woman who had seen every manipulation, every lie, every way that people could damage their children while maintaining a facade of respectability, and she was finished tolerating it. "This court finds," she began, her voice resonating through the courtroom with judicial authority, "that there is substantial evidence of child endangerment in the defendant's residence. The evidence demonstrates a pattern of substance abuse, domestic violence, and negligence. The minor child has exhibited clear signs of trauma consistent with exposure to violent incidents and an unstable home environment. Based on these findings, and based on my primary obligation to ensure the safety and welfare of this child, I am issuing an emergency protective order, effective immediately." Judge Henderson's words fell like hammer strikes, each one destroying another pillar of David's crumbling defense. "Full legal and physical custody of James Mitchell is hereby granted to Sarah Caroline Mitchell. The defendant, David Thomas Mitchell, is prohibited from unsupervised contact with the minor child pending completion of a court-ordered substance abuse evaluation and residential rehabilitation program. Any visitation will be limited to supervised visits at a CPS-approved facility, contingent upon the defendant's demonstrated sobriety and completion of an anger management course." David's face went completely white. His attorney was frantically scribbling notes, but even seemed to recognize that the game was over. The evidence was overwhelming, the judge's reasoning airtight, and the protective order legally unassailable. "Additionally," Judge Henderson continued, "I am ordering the defendant to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation to assess his fitness for future parenting responsibilities. This evaluation will include substance abuse screening, domestic violence assessment, and mental health evaluation. The defendant will be responsible for all costs associated with these evaluations and the required rehabilitation program." She turned to Sarah, and her expression softened slightly, not warm, but less glacial. "Ms. Mitchell, custody is restored to you. This court recognizes your sacrifice, your dedication to your son, and your instinctive protection of his welfare. While your work schedule was presented as evidence of negligence, this court finds that your employment provided necessary stability and resources for your child. Single parenthood is not a disqualifying factor in custody determinations when the parent is demonstrating appropriate care and putting the child's needs first." Sarah felt her knees buckle, Robert caught her arm, steadying her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had prepared herself for loss, for compromised custody, for a fractured life. She wasn't prepared for victory. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at, who was watching his mother with the perceptive awareness that small children sometimes possess. He didn't understand the legal terminology, but he understood that something fundamental had shifted. His mother's body language had transformed from terrified to relieved. Judge Henderson raised her voice again, addressing the courtroom at large. "I want to be clear about something. This is not a case of false allegations or parental alienation. This is not a case of a mother attempting to weaponize family court. This is a case of a child whose trauma response, his recognition of the police dog that was present during a violent incident at his father's residence, unlocked evidence of genuine danger. This child essentially through his behavioral response, and we were wise enough to listen." She turned directly to David, her eyes filled with judicial contempt. "Mr. Mitchell, you had every advantage. You had financial resources, professional success, and the benefit of doubt. But you squandered your relationship with your son by choosing substance abuse and violence. Your son does not need you right now. What he needs is safety, stability, and a parent who can provide unconditional love without the complication of addiction. You will get that opportunity again only if and when you demonstrate genuine commitment to recovery." Her voice became even harder. "If there is any violation of this protective order, any attempt to contact the minor child outside of supervised visitation, any missed rehabilitation appointments, any indication of continued substance abuse, I will personally ensure that charges of child endangerment are pursued to the full extent of the law. Do you understand me?" David nodded mutely, his entire body slumped in defeat. Judge Henderson turned to the CPS representative. "I want monthly check-ins with Ms. Mitchell and the minor child for the next 6 months. Any concerns are to be reported to this court immediately. I also want a follow-up evaluation of the defendant's residence after he completes the rehabilitation program. This case will remain open, and we will reconvene in 6 months to determine if modifications to this order are appropriate." She returned to the bench and made her final pronouncement. "This hearing is adjourned. The protective order is effective immediately. Court is dismissed." The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through every fiber of Sarah's being. It was done. It was actually done. For a moment there was complete silence in the courtroom. Then Sarah moved before she even realized what she was doing. She scooped into her arms, holding him against her chest, her body racking with sobs of relief, wrapped his small arms around her neck, and even though he didn't fully understand what had happened, he held on like his life depended on it. "Mommy's got you, baby," Sarah whispered into his hair, her voice breaking. "Mommy's always got you. You're safe now, you're safe." Around them, the courtroom erupted in quiet movement. Robert was gathering documents, his expression a mixture of relief and vindication. Officer was quietly excusing himself, his professional duty complete. The CPS representative was making notes on her tablet. David sat motionless at his table, his entire world having collapsed in the span of an hour. His attorney was whispering something to him, but he seemed not to hear. Martin's trademark confidence had been completely obliterated. He was already calculating damage control, already thinking about how this loss would look on his record. Judge Henderson passed by Sarah on her way back to chambers. She paused, placing a brief, gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You fought for your son," she said quietly. "That's what matters. Take care of him." "I will," Sarah replied, tears still streaming down her face. Thank you so much." As Sarah walked toward the courtroom doors, still in her arms, she felt like she was floating. Everything she had feared, losing custody, having her love questioned, watching her son be handed to a man spiraling into addiction, none of it had happened. The system had actually worked. Justice had actually prevailed. A judge had listened, investigated, and acted to protect a child. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah sat down and knelt to his level. "Sweetheart, we're going home now, just you and me. And we're going to stay together, okay? Forever and ever." Nodded solemnly, then asked the most 3-year-old question possible. "Can we get ice cream?" Sarah laughed through her tears, the sound emerging as something between a sob and genuine joy. "Yes, baby, we can get all the ice cream you want." As they walked toward the courthouse exit, Sarah held her son's small hand in hers, and for the first time in months she allowed herself to breathe freely. The nightmare wasn't entirely over. David still needed to complete his rehabilitation. There would be supervised visits to navigate, and trauma wounds would take time to heal. But was safe. He was hers. And that was everything. 6 months had passed since the courtroom hearing that changed everything. Sarah stood in her small kitchen on a Saturday morning, watching through the window as he played in the backyard with the golden retriever they'd adopted 3 months ago. The dog's name was Sunshine, and she was the complete opposite of Bella, gentle, patient, and therapeutic in ways that pediatric therapist had specifically recommended. The therapist had explained that reintroducing positive experiences with dogs could help process the trauma associated with Bella, and the violent night when the police dog had been present. Was laughing, actually laughing, as Sunshine licked his face and knocked him gently to the ground. The sound of his uninhibited joy was music that Sarah had feared she might never hear again. For the first 3 months after the custody hearing had still struggled with nightmares and anxiety. His therapist had explained that trauma recovery wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks and difficult days. But gradually, with consistent safety, stable routines, and professional support, had begun to heal. The nightmares had decreased from several times a week to perhaps once every 2 weeks. His had evolved from desperate attachment to normal toddler affection. He'd made new friends at his and had begun engaging more playfully with other children. Most importantly, he'd stopped flinching at loud noises. The sudden sounds that had triggered anxiety responses were now simply part of the normal world instead of harbingers of danger. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Robert. David completed his 90-day rehab program. First supervised visitation is scheduled for next Thursday at the CPS facility. How are you feeling about it? Sarah's stomach tightened. David's rehabilitation had been successful, or at least, the reports indicated that he'd completed the program, maintained sobriety, and participated in anger management and parenting classes. The CPS caseworker had conducted monthly visits to Sarah's home and had noted consistent positive progress. Was thriving. The protective order was doing exactly what it was supposed to do: protect the vulnerable while allowing for the possibility of healing and redemption for the parent who had failed. The first supervised visitation was both necessary and terrifying. Sarah knew that if David maintained sobriety and completed the rehabilitation requirements, there would eventually be discussions about expanding his contact with. The legal system believed in rehabilitation and family reunification when possible, but Sarah's maternal instincts were more complicated. She wanted David to get healthy, genuinely healthy, but she also wanted to ensure that would never again experience the terror he'd lived through before. She texted back, nervous but supportive, "We'll be fine with professional supervision, we're ready." The truth was more nuanced than that text conveyed. Sarah had done her own healing over the 6 months. She'd started therapy herself, processing the trauma of nearly losing custody, the guilt she'd carried about not recognizing the severity of David's substance abuse earlier, and the anger at a system that had initially been stacked against her. Her therapist had helped her understand that she wasn't responsible for David's choices, that her 70-hour work weeks didn't make her a bad mother, and that her fierce protection of was strength, not overreaction. She'd also made practical changes. While she still worked in trauma nursing, she transitioned to more day shifts, allowing her to pick up from at reasonable hours. Her financial situation had improved slightly because David had been ordered to pay child support, not as punishment, but as his legal obligation to contribute to care. The money helped pay for ongoing therapy and reduce the pressure on Sarah's shoulders. Most significantly, Sarah had learned to trust the system when it worked correctly. Judge Henderson had become something of a legend in her courthouse, the judge who investigated a custody case and uncovered child endangerment, the judge who listened to a child's silent testimony, the judge who acted decisively to protect the vulnerable. Sarah had read an article in the Houston Legal Review about the case, with names changed for privacy, and it had explored how judicial wisdom could sometimes transcend the adversarial limitations of the legal system. On Thursday morning, Sarah drove to the CPS-supervised visitation facility. The building was designed to be non-threatening, soft colors, comfortable furniture, toys and games strategically arranged to create a safe environment for parent-child interaction. A trained CPS monitor would be present throughout the visit, and the entire session would be documented. Was nervous but curious. "Will Daddy be there?" he asked from his car seat. "Yes, baby. Daddy's going to be there, and there's going to be a nice person there to make sure everything is good and safe. Remember, it's just a visit. You get to see Daddy for a little while and then Mommy picks you up. Okay?" "Okay," said solemnly. He'd been prepped for this by his therapist, who had used dolls and role play to help him understand that supervised visits didn't mean anything was wrong with him, and that it was okay to be curious about his father even if his father had made bad choices. When David arrived for the visit, Sarah barely recognized him. 6 months of sobriety had physically transformed him. The bloat from alcohol consumption had diminished. The dark circles under his eyes had faded. He looked like someone who had actually slept well and taken care of himself. More importantly, his eyes were clear and present in a way they hadn't been in years. David looked at with an expression that broke Sarah's heart a little, a combination of desperate love and profound regret. He knelt down to Slevel. "Hi, buddy. I've missed you so much." Was cautious but not fearful. That was progress. He allowed David to hug him, and Sarah watched as David held his son gently, his shoulders trembling slightly. He was crying, quiet tears of remorse and gratitude for the second chance he was being given. The CPS monitor seated everyone in a small room and began the visit. Sarah waited in the adjacent reception area, checking her watch every few minutes. An hour passed, then another. When the visit ended, emerged looking tired but not traumatized. David walked out behind him, his eyes red-rimmed but his demeanor calm and respectful. He didn't try to negotiate with Sarah or ask for anything beyond what the court had ordered. He simply said, "Thank you for bringing him. I know I don't deserve this chance, but I'm grateful." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She secured in his car seat and they drove home in relative silence. "Daddy's different," said quietly from the backseat. "Yes, baby, Daddy's trying to be better," Sarah replied. Over the following months, more supervised visits occurred. Each one went smoothly. David maintained his sobriety. His behavior remained appropriate. The CPS caseworker noted consistent positive progress. Judge Henderson scheduled a follow-up hearing to determine if modifications to the protective order were warranted. One afternoon, Sarah took to the park, the same park where they'd encountered the service dog months before, pointed at the dog calmly and said, "Doggy," with a smile instead of fear. Sarah's heart soared. Her son was healing. The trauma that had nearly destroyed their lives was being processed and integrated into his developing psyche. A year after the courtroom hearing, Judge Henderson modified the protective order. David was allowed supervised weekend visits at a neutral location. The psychological evaluations showed genuine progress. His substance abuse counselor confirmed continued sobriety. While the journey to full unsupervised custody would be long and would require consistent proof of stability, the system was working, imperfectly, but meaningfully. On a quiet evening, Sarah sat with, reading him bedtime stories without interruption or interruption by nightmares to follow. She thought about that fateful day when her 3-year-old son had screamed at a police dog in a courtroom, unlocking evidence that had saved his life. "I love you, Mommy," whispered as he drifted toward sleep, his thumb in his mouth, his security blanket clutched against his chest. "I love you too, baby, so much. Forever," Sarah replied, kissing his forehead. And in that moment, surrounded by safety and unconditional love, Sarah understood that sometimes justice comes through the most unexpected pathways. Sometimes a child's trauma becomes the catalyst for truth. Sometimes the system actually works. And sometimes love, fierce, protective, unwavering love, is stronger than any force that threatens to tear a family apart. Would grow up knowing that his mother had fought for him with everything she had. He would understand that his scream in the courtroom, his body's involuntary response to trauma, had mattered. It had been heard. It had been acted upon. And it had changed the trajectory of his entire life. The nightmare was over. The healing had begun. And their new beginning was just getting started.